In the dusty encampments of Canaan, where the tents of Isaac stretched across the land promised to his father Abraham, a woman named Rebekah carried within her womb a war she did not yet understand. The year was approximately 1836 BC, and the patriarch Isaac, son of Abraham, child of promise, the one who had once lain bound upon an altar while his father raised the knife, had married the beautiful woman from Mesopotamia some 20 years earlier. For 2 decades, Rebekah's womb had remained closed, a bitter echo of Sarah's own long barrenness. Isaac, who knew what it meant to be a miracle child, pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, and the Lord heard him. But when conception finally came, Rebekah discovered that answered prayer does not always arrive gently. The children within her struggled so violently that she cried out in anguish, wondering if she could survive the pregnancy. "If it is thus," she gasped, "why is this happening to me?" In her desperation, she did what her mother-in-law Sarah had never done. She went directly to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord spoke to her words that would echo through centuries of human history. "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." 2 nations. Not merely 2 sons, but 2 destinies locked in cosmic struggle before they had drawn their first breath. The older serving the younger, a reversal of everything the ancient world held sacred about birthright and primogeniture. Rebekah carried this prophecy in her heart, turning it over and over as the months passed, and her body stretched to accommodate the warfare within. She told no one, not even Isaac. Perhaps she did not fully understand it herself. Perhaps she sensed that understanding would only come through the painful unfolding of years. The birth, when it came, was as dramatic as the pregnancy had been. The first child emerged red and hairy, covered in what looked like a garment of fur, so striking that they named him Esau, meaning hairy. But even as the midwives attended to the firstborn, the second child's hand shot forth, gripping his brother's heel as if trying to pull him back, as if contesting the order of their arrival from the very first moment. They named this second son Yaakov, Jacob, a name that meant heel-grabber, or, more ominously, supplanter. In the ancient Near East, names were not mere labels, but prophecies, declarations of identity that shaped destiny. From his first breath, Jacob was marked as one who would grasp, who would reach, who would take what belonged to another. Isaac was 60 years old when his sons were born, and as they grew, the household began to fracture along lines that would never fully heal. Esau became a man of the field, a skillful hunter whose arrows found their mark and whose traps never came home empty. He was a man of the open spaces, of blood and sinew and the wild, places where civilization gave way to instinct. His skin was weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused from bow and blade, his voice carrying the rough confidence of one who had faced lions and bears and emerged victorious. Isaac loved him, loved the taste of the wild game Esau brought home, loved the primal masculinity of this son who embodied everything the contemplative patriarch himself was not. Jacob, by contrast, was a quiet man who dwelt among the tents. The Hebrew word used to describe him, tam, suggests completeness, integrity, perhaps even a certain calculated shrewdness. While Esau roamed the wilderness, Jacob stayed close to home, learning the ways of the flocks, mastering the domestic arts of his mother's world. He was smooth where Esau was rough, thoughtful where Esau was impulsive, patient where Esau demanded immediate satisfaction. Rebekah loved him, and though the text does not explain why, one wonders if she saw in this quieter son the instrument of the prophecy she had carried in secret for so many years. The older shall serve the younger. Perhaps she looked at Jacob and saw destiny waiting to unfold. The first crack in the family foundation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a bowl of lentil stew. Esau returned from the field one day utterly famished, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that clouds judgment and magnifies immediate desire until nothing else exists. Jacob was cooking, red lentil stew, the aroma filling the tent with warmth and promise. Esau demanded food with the desperation of a man who could see nothing beyond his present hunger. "Let me gulp down some of that red stuff," he said, using crude language that revealed his state of mind. The Hebrew suggests hasty, almost animalistic consumption. "Pour it down my throat." Jacob's response revealed the calculating mind that had been watching, waiting, perhaps planning for years. Sell me your birthright today. Not tomorrow, not after you've eaten and recovered your senses. Today, now, while your judgment is impaired and your need is overwhelming. It was the move of a man who understood leverage, who had perhaps long resented being second-born by mere moments, who saw an opportunity and seized it with the same instinct that had made him grab his brother's heel in the womb. The birthright Esau so casually bartered away was no small thing. In the ancient Near East, the firstborn son received a double portion of the inheritance. If there were 2 sons, the firstborn received 2/3 of everything. But the birthright was far more than economic. The firstborn was the spiritual head of the family after the father's death, the one who would lead worship, pronounce blessings, and carry forward the family's covenant relationship with God. In this particular family, the birthright carried the weight of the Abrahamic covenant itself, the promise of land, of descendants as numerous as the stars, of being a blessing to all nations. Esau, in his hunger, traded eternity for a bowl of soup. "What use is a birthright to me?" Esau said, and in that moment revealed the chasm between the brothers' souls. For Esau, the birthright was abstract, distant, irrelevant to the immediate reality of his growling stomach. For Jacob it was everything, the validation he had sought since emerging second from the womb, the spiritual inheritance he believed should have been his from the beginning. Esau ate and drank, rose and went his way. The text adds a devastating editorial comment. Thus Esau despised his birthright. The Hebrew word for despised suggests treating something as worthless, holding it in contempt. The hunter who could track prey for miles, who could wait in patient stillness for the perfect shot, could not wait through a single afternoon's hunger for something infinitely more valuable than venison. Years passed, and the quiet tension in Isaac's household calcified into something harder and more permanent. Isaac grew old. His eyes dimmed until he could no longer distinguish one figure from another, one face from another. The patriarch who had once looked up from the altar on Mount Moriah to see the ram caught in the thicket now lived in perpetual twilight, dependent on touch and taste and the voices of those around him. He summoned Esau, his beloved firstborn, and spoke words that set the final tragedy in motion. "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." The blessing Isaac intended to give was no mere well-wishing. In the ancient world, a patriarch's deathbed blessing was considered legally and spiritually binding, a transfer of power and destiny that could not be revoked once spoken. Isaac was preparing to pass the mantle of covenant leadership to Esau, to confirm upon the hunter the promises God had given to Abraham and renewed to Isaac himself. Whether Isaac knew of Rebekah's prophecy, whether he was deliberately defying divine will or simply following cultural convention, the text does not say. What it shows us is a blind old man craving one last taste of his son's game, ready to pronounce words that would echo through eternity. But Rebekah was listening. She had carried the prophecy for decades, watched the 2 nations within her womb grow into 2 men who could not have been more different, and now she saw the moment of crisis approaching. The older shall serve the younger, but Isaac was about to bless the older with everything. Did she pray? Did she wrestle with her conscience? The text moves with terrible swiftness from her overhearing to her action. She summoned Jacob and laid out a plan of breathtaking audacity. Jacob would bring her 2 young goats from the flock. She would prepare them in the way Isaac loved, and Jacob would bring the food to his father and receive the blessing meant for Esau. Jacob's objection was telling, not moral but practical. "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." He did not say, "This is wrong." He did not say, "I cannot deceive my father." He said, "What if I get caught?" Rebekah swept aside his concerns with fierce maternal determination. "Let your curse be on me, my son, only obey my voice." She dressed him in Esau's finest garments, the clothes that carried the smell of the field. the scent of a hunter's life. She covered his smooth hands and neck with the skins of the young goats, transforming her quiet, tent-dwelling son into a rough approximation of her wild firstborn. What followed was a scene of almost unbearable tension. Jacob entered his father's presence carrying food he did not hunt, wearing clothes that were not his skin disguised to feel like his brother's. Isaac questioned him, "Who are you, my son?" And Jacob spoke the lie that would define him for decades. "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." Isaac was suspicious. The voice was wrong. "The voice is Jacob's voice," he said, reaching out with trembling hands to touch this son who claimed to be Esau. He felt the goat skin covering Jacob's hands, felt the rough texture that mimicked his firstborn's hair, and his doubt wavered. "Are you really my son, Esau?" The question hung in the air, one last chance for truth, one final opportunity for Jacob to turn back from the precipice. "I am," Jacob said. Isaac ate. He drank. He called his son close for a kiss, and when he smelled the garments, Esau's garments, rich with the scent of the open field, something in the old patriarch seemed to settle. He began to pronounce the blessing that would shape nations. "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." The words were irrevocable. In the ancient understanding, blessing once spoken took on a life of its own, flying from the patriarch's lips to lodge in the recipient's destiny. Jacob had what he came for, the blessing that confirmed the birthright, the spiritual authority over his brother, the covenant promises of Abraham passed down through Isaac, and now resting upon him. He withdrew from his father's presence, carrying words that would sustain Israel for millennia. Esau returned from the hunt scarcely after Jacob had departed. He prepared the savoury food his father loved, brought it with eager anticipation, and spoke words that shattered the fragile peace. "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." Isaac's response revealed the horror of recognition. "Who are you?" When Esau identified himself, the old patriarch began to tremble violently. The Hebrew suggests uncontrollable shaking, the physical manifestation of spiritual revelation. "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." Esau's cry echoes across the centuries as one of the most anguished sounds in all of Scripture. A great and exceedingly bitter cry that welled up from the depths of a soul suddenly aware of what had been lost. "Bless me, even me also, O my father. Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" But Isaac's hands were empty. The words had been spoken. The blessing had been given. All that remained for Esau was a secondary pronouncement, more prophecy than blessing. "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. The older shall serve the younger." Rebekah's prophecy, hidden for 6 decades, had come to pass. But at what cost? Esau's grief curdled into murderous rage. He comforted himself with a plan. "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." The Hebrew word for comforted suggests that thoughts of fratricide were the only solace Esau could find for his devastation. When these words reached Rebekah, and in a household of tents, words travelled quickly, she knew that her quiet son must flee or die. She summoned Jacob one last time, speaking with the urgency of a mother who saw death stalking her household. "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereft of you both in one day?" The plan made terrible sense. If Jacob stayed, Esau would kill him. If Esau killed Jacob, blood vengeance would demand Esau's life in return. Rebekah would lose both sons to a single act of violence, born from a blessing she herself had engineered. So Jacob must run to Haran to Rebekah's brother Laban, to a land 500 miles distant where Esau's rage could not reach him. The deception that won him the blessing now drove him from everything the blessing promised. The land of Canaan, pronounced his inheritance just hours before, became a place he could not safely remain. Isaac summoned Jacob once more, and here the narrative reveals something unexpected. The patriarch who had been deceived now blessed his deceiver freely, openly, without manipulation or goatskin disguises. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. Whether Isaac had come to accept the deception as divine providence, whether he recognized that God's purposes had been accomplished despite or through human scheming, the text does not say. What it shows is a father blessing a son with open eyes and willing heart, confirming what had been stolen as though it had been freely given. And so Jacob departed. He walked out of the only home he had ever known, leaving behind a father he had deceived, a brother who wanted him dead, and a mother he would never see again. The quiet man who dwelt among tents was now a fugitive in the wilderness, carrying a blessing he had grasped through deception, a birthright purchased with lentil stew and a future he could not begin to imagine. The heel grabber had finally gotten what he reached for, and it had cost him everything. The road stretched north toward Haran, empty and hostile, 500 miles of uncertainty lying between the young man and whatever safety awaited him. Behind him, Esau sharpened his blade and nursed his fury. Ahead, only the unknown. Above, a heaven that had remained silent through all the scheming and deception. A God who had not yet spoken directly to this grandson of Abraham, this inheritor of promises he barely understood. Night was coming, and with it, the first of many lonely camps in the wilderness. Jacob walked on, the blessing burning in his memory, the guilt gnawing at his conscience, the fear of his brother driving every step. He did not know, could not know, that heaven itself was about to break open, that the God who had seemed so distant was closer than the very ground beneath his feet. He knew only that he was alone and afraid and running from everything he had ever known toward everything he could not yet see. The supplanter had become a fugitive, the grabber had been driven from his grasp, and somewhere in the wilderness ahead, a stone waited to become a pillow, and a dream waited to become a doorway between worlds. The road north from Beersheba cut through a landscape that seemed designed to break a man's spirit. Jacob walked alone, his sandals raising small clouds of dust that settled on his robes and skin, working into the creases of his face until he could taste the grit between his teeth. The terrain of ancient Canaan was not the pastoral paradise later generations might imagine. It was a land of extremes, of scorching days and frigid nights, of rocky hills and sudden wadis that could flash with deadly floods after distant rains. Travellers moved in caravans for good reason. The wilderness held bandits who preyed on solitary figures, wild animals that grew bold at dusk, and a silence so profound it could drive a man mad with the sound of his own thoughts. But Jacob had no caravan. He had fled with whatever he could carry, moving too quickly to arrange proper provisions or travelling companions. The young man who had spent his life among the tents, who had mastered the domestic arts of cooking and animal husbandry, who had never ventured far from his mother's watchful presence, now found himself utterly alone in a world he barely knew. Every rustle in the scrub brush made him flinch. Every distant cry of a jackal reminded him how vulnerable he was. The blessing he carried, the words his father had spoken over him just days before, seemed impossibly distant, almost mocking in their promise of prosperity and dominion. What good was lordship over nations to a man who might not survive the week? The distance Jacob needed to travel was staggering by ancient standards. Haran lay approximately 500 miles to the northeast, a journey that would take weeks of steady walking, longer if he encountered obstacles or lost his way. The route passed through territories controlled by various peoples, some friendly to strangers, others decidedly not. There were no inns in the modern sense, No reliable sources of food and water, no guarantee that the next settlement would welcome a lone traveller with no obvious means of payment. Jacob carried the wealth of his father's blessing in words, but words did not fill an empty stomach or frighten away predators in the night. The first day passed in a blur of motion and anxiety. Jacob pushed himself hard, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Beersheba, between himself and Esau's rage. He watched over his shoulder more than he watched the road ahead, half expecting to see his brother's familiar silhouette cresting each hill, bow in hand, vengeance in his eyes. The fear was not irrational. Esau was a hunter, a man who could track prey across miles of wilderness, who knew how to move silently and strike without warning. If he had decided to pursue rather than wait, Jacob would never see him coming. But the horizon remained empty. The only movement was the shimmer of heat rising from the stones, the occasional hawk circling overhead, the lizards that darted away at his approach. Jacob was alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were not kind company. The guilt came in waves, each one threatening to drown him. He saw his father's face, not the blind, aged face of the man he had deceived, but the younger father of his childhood, the man who had taught him about Abraham's God, who had shared stories of the covenant and the promises. He heard Isaac's trembling voice asking, "Who are you, my son?" and felt again the weight of his own lie. "I am Esau, your firstborn." The words had come so easily in the moment when Rebekah's scheme had seemed like destiny unfolding. Now they burned in his memory like a brand, and Esau, the brother he had wronged not once but twice, first taking the birthright, then stealing the blessing. Jacob could still hear that terrible cry, that anguished wail that had penetrated even the tent walls where he had hidden after his escape from Isaac's presence. "Bless me, even me also, O my father." The sound haunted him. Esau was many things, impulsive, carnal, dismissive of spiritual realities, but he was also Jacob's twin, the one who had shared their mother's womb, who had entered the world mere moments before him. They had wrestled in the darkness before birth, and now their wrestling had produced wounds that might never heal. What kind of man deceives his own blind father? What kind of brother steals not just inheritance, but identity, wearing another's clothes, mimicking another's roughness, claiming another's name? Jacob had always told himself that he deserved the blessing, that God had ordained it before their birth, that Esau had forfeited his rights through the careless sale of his birthright. But here in the wilderness, with no one to convince but himself, the justifications rang hollow. He had lied, he had manipulated, he had taken what was not freely given, and now he was paying the price, exiled from everything he loved, hunted by his own flesh and blood, carrying promises he had grasped through deception. The sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that would have been beautiful if Jacob had possessed the capacity to appreciate beauty. His legs ached, his throat was parched. The landscape around him offered little comfort. Rocky outcroppings, sparse vegetation, the distant bleating of sheep that belonged to strangers. He needed to find a place to rest before full darkness fell, before the temperature dropped and the predators emerged from their daytime hiding places. He came upon a place that seemed as good as any. A slight depression in the terrain that offered minimal shelter from the wind, a scattering of stones that might serve some purpose. There was nothing remarkable about the location, nothing to suggest it held any significance. It was simply where Jacob's strength gave out, where his body refused to carry him further. The place had a name, Luz, though Jacob did not know it yet. It was a Canaanite settlement nearby, ordinary and unremarkable, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Jacob gathered what he needed for the night. There would be no tent, no carefully prepared bed, no servants to attend to his needs. The heir of Abraham's promises would sleep on the bare ground like a common vagrant. He selected a stone from among the many scattered across the terrain, not for comfort, for stones offer no comfort, but perhaps for protection, a hard surface to elevate his head above the crawling things of the earth, or perhaps simply because it was there. The Hebrew text states simply that he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head. It was an act of desperation, not devotion. Jacob was not preparing a sacred site. He was simply trying to survive the night. The darkness came quickly, as it does in the wilderness. One moment the sky held the last traces of sunset. The next, the stars emerged in their countless multitudes, the same stars God had shown to Abraham when he promised descendants beyond number. Jacob lay on the hard ground, the stone beneath his head, his body exhausted but his mind refusing to quiet. Above him wheeled the constellations his grandfather had counted, the heavens that testified to promises that now seemed impossibly far away. The silence of the wilderness is not truly silence. It is filled with small sounds that the ear strains to identify, the wind moving through sparse brush, the distant call of the night birds, the soft pad of creatures moving through the darkness on business of their own. To Jacob, every sound was potential threat, every rustle a possible enemy. He was a man of the tents, unaccustomed to sleeping exposed under the open sky. The vulnerability was almost unbearable, but deeper than the physical fear was the spiritual desolation. In the ancient Near Eastern worldview, gods were territorial. Each land had its own deities, its own spiritual powers that held sway within their boundaries. By leaving Canaan, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants, Jacob was entering a kind of spiritual no man's land. The God of his fathers was the God of Canaan, the God of the promise. Did his power extend into the wilderness? Did his presence accompany a fugitive fleeing the consequences of his own deception? Jacob did not know. He had heard stories of his grandfather's encounters with God, had listened to his father recount the terror and wonder of Mount Moriah. But God had never spoken directly to Jacob. The covenant was something he had inherited, not something he had experienced. He knew about God. He did not yet know God. This distinction matters profoundly for understanding what was about to happen. Jacob was not a man of deep faith lying down to receive a divine reward. He was a schemer whose schemes had finally caught up with him, a deceiver who had been driven from his home by the consequences of his deception. If there was any prayer on his lips that night, the text does not record it. If there was any expectation of divine intervention, nothing in Jacob's prior experience would have warranted it. He was simply a frightened, exhausted, guilty young man trying to survive until morning. The ancient rabbis would later imagine what thoughts might have passed through Jacob's mind in those dark hours. Some suggested he reviewed his sins and felt the full weight of his unworthiness. Others proposed he worried about his future, how he would find Laban, whether his uncle would receive him, whether he would ever see his parents again. Still, others imagined him wondering about the blessing he carried, whether words obtained through deception could truly hold divine power, whether God would honour promises made to a deceiver. All of these speculations point to a profound truth. Jacob went to sleep that night as a man in crisis, not merely external, but internal, not merely physical, but spiritual. The cold settled over the wilderness as the night deepened. Jacob pulled his cloak tighter, feeling the chill penetrate to his bones. The stone beneath his head was unyielding, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the comfort of his father's tents. His mother had promised to send for him when Esau's anger cooled. "A few days," she had said. But even in his exhaustion, Jacob must have sensed that he would not see home again for a very long time, if ever. The stars continued their slow rotation overhead, indifferent to the small figure huddled on the ground below. The God who had spoken to Abraham beneath these same stars, who had confirmed his covenant to Isaac, remained silent. Jacob's breathing gradually slowed as exhaustion finally overwhelmed anxiety. His muscles, tense with fear and fatigue, began to relax. The sounds of the wilderness faded as consciousness gave way to something deeper. And then, in the darkness of that ordinary night, in that unremarkable place, on that uncomfortable stone pillow, the God of Abraham and Isaac did something utterly unexpected. He came to the fugitive. He spoke to the deceiver. He revealed himself to a man who had done nothing to deserve revelation, and everything to deserve judgment. Jacob slept, and heaven prepared to open. The silence of the wilderness was about to be shattered by a vision that would echo through millennia of human history. The stone beneath his head was about to become the foundation of something sacred, and the young man who thought himself alone, abandoned, beyond the reach of blessing, he was about to discover that he had stumbled into the very dwelling place of God. The night held its breath, the stars kept their ancient watch, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between earth and heaven, a ladder began to appear. The vision came with the strange clarity that marks divine revelation, not the fuzzy confusion of ordinary dreams, but something sharper, more real than waking life itself. Jacob's sleeping mind beheld what his waking eyes could never have perceived, a structure rising from the very ground where he lay, ascending upward through the darkness, stretching beyond the stars themselves until it touched the throne room of heaven. The Hebrew word used to describe this structure is sulam, a term that appears nowhere else in the entire Bible, as if the language itself had to reach for something unprecedented to capture what Jacob saw. Translators have rendered it ladder or stairway, but perhaps neither word fully conveys the reality. A connection between worlds, a bridge across the infinite chasm separating earth from heaven, creature from creator. The sulam was not merely a static structure. It pulsed with activity, alive with movement that defied earthly physics. Angels, the Malachim, the messengers of God, were ascending and descending upon it in continuous procession. The detail is remarkable and has puzzled interpreters for millennia, ascending first, then descending. If angels dwell in heaven, should they not descend first to reach earth? The order suggests something profound about the nature of divine activity. The angels were already present on earth, already at work in the world below, and now they were returning to give account, to receive new instructions, to maintain the ceaseless communication between the realm of mortals and the court of the Almighty. Jacob was witnessing the hidden machinery of providence, the constant traffic of heaven that sustains creation moment by moment, ordinarily invisible to human eyes, but now revealed in all its staggering complexity. The sight alone would have been enough to transform a man's understanding of reality. But the dream was not finished. At the top of the ladder, or perhaps standing beside Jacob himself, for the Hebrew allows both readings, was the Lord. Not merely an angel, not simply a messenger, but Yahweh himself, the God who had walked with Abraham, the God who had spared Isaac on Mount Moriah, the God whose name was whispered with reverence in the tents of the patriarch. This was the first time in Jacob's recorded life that God spoke directly to him. Everything he knew about the divine had come second-hand. Stories from his grandfather's generation, blessings pronounced by his father, the prophecy his mother had received before his birth. Now, in the most unlikely circumstances, the God of the covenant addressed the fugitive personally. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac." The words established identity and relationship simultaneously. This was not some regional deity of the wilderness, not a spirit of this particular place, but the God of Jacob's own lineage, the God who had called Abraham out of Ur, who had promised him a nation and a land, who had tested him with the near sacrifice of Isaac and provided a ram in the thicket. This God was now claiming Jacob, linking him to the chain of covenant that stretched back 3 generations and would stretch forward through all of human history. But why would such a God speak to such a man? Jacob had lied to his blind father, stolen his brother's blessing, and fled the consequences of his actions like a common criminal. He had shown no particular devotion, offered no notable prayers, demonstrated no exemplary faith. By any reasonable measure, he deserved judgment, not revelation. Yet God spoke to him, and not with words of condemnation, but with words of extraordinary promise. "The land on which you lie I will give to you, and to your offspring." The land. Jacob was lying on a rocky ground in the middle of nowhere, a fugitive passing through territory that belonged to strangers. He possessed nothing, no property, no home, not even a proper bed. Yet God declared that this very ground, and all the land of Canaan with it, would belong to him and his descendants. The promise echoed what God had told Abraham decades earlier, but now it was being spoken directly to Jacob, personalizing the covenant, making it his own rather than merely inherited. "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south." Descendants beyond counting, another echo of the Abrahamic promise, now confirmed to a man who had no wife, no children, nothing but a stone for a pillow and a price on his head. The promise must have seemed almost absurd in its grandeur. Jacob was running for his life, uncertain if he would survive the journey to Haran, and God was speaking of descendants spreading in every direction like dust scattered by the wind. Yet this was precisely the nature of divine promise. It operated not according to present circumstances, but according to the purposes of the one who sees the end from the beginning. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. This was the heart of the Abrahamic covenant, the reason God had called one man out of paganism to begin something new in human history. Abraham's family was not chosen for their own sake alone, but for the sake of the world, to be a channel through which blessing would flow to every nation, every tribe, every family on earth. Jacob, the deceiver, the schemer, the man whose very name meant supplanter, was now confirmed as a link in this chain of universal blessing. Whatever he had done, however he had obtained the birthright and blessing, God was ratifying his place in the covenant line. The sovereign purposes of heaven were incorporating even Jacob's deception into a larger story of redemption. But the vision was not finished. The promises of land and descendants and blessing were magnificent, but they addressed the distant future. Jacob needed something more immediate. He needed to know that he would survive the next week, the next month, the long journey ahead. He needed to know that the God of his fathers would be his God too. Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just in Canaan, but in the wilderness. Not just in blessing, but in exile. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. These words were for Jacob alone. Not just a repetition of ancestral promises, but a personal commitment tailored to his specific situation. I am with you, present tense, immediate, here in this wilderness where you thought yourself abandoned. I will keep you, protection for the dangerous journey ahead, provision for the uncertain years to come. Wherever you go, not just in Canaan, not just in the promised land, but in Haran, in exile, in every place your wandering takes you, I will bring you back. A promise of return, an assurance that this flight was not permanent, that the land promised to him would indeed become his home. I will not leave you. The persistence of divine presence, the refusal of God to abandon his purposes or his people. The structure of God's speech reveals a profound theological reality. He began with the cosmic promises, land, descendants, universal blessing, the great sweeping declarations that connected Jacob to the grand narrative of redemption. But he ended with the intimate, the personal, the immediate, I am with you. The God who ruled the heavens and commanded the angels also walked with fugitives. The Lord who would bless all nations through Jacob's offspring also cared whether Jacob survived the night. This was not an abstract deity, not a distant force, but a God who combined transcendence with immanence, who was both infinitely above and intimately near. The vision of the ladder itself carried layers of meaning that would unfold across centuries of reflection. In the ancient Near East, ziggurats, the great stepped temple towers of Mesopotamia, were understood as connections between earth and heaven, stairways by which the gods descended to receive worship, and by which priests ascended to offer sacrifice. Jacob was heading toward that very region, toward Haran and the land of his mother's birth, where such structures dominated the landscape. But God was showing him that the true connection between heaven and earth was not made by human hands. No tower built of bricks could bridge the gap between mortal and immortal. Only God could establish that link, and he established it not in the great cities of Mesopotamia, but in an empty wilderness, not for the proud builders of empires, but for a lonely fugitive sleeping on the ground. The angels ascending and descending spoke of constant divine activity in the world below. Jacob had felt utterly alone, abandoned to the consequences of his actions, cut off from the household where God was worshipped and the covenant was kept. But the vision revealed that heaven's attention had never wavered. Angels had been present all along, watching, guarding, reporting, descending with new instructions. The wilderness was not empty of divine presence. It was teeming with invisible activity. Jacob had simply been blind to it. Now, for one luminous moment, the veil was pulled back, and he saw reality as it truly was. A universe charged with the traffic of heaven. A a creation held together by the ceaseless work of the Almighty's messengers. The dream also spoke to Jacob's specific fears and failures. He had deceived his father to obtain a blessing. Now God blessed him directly, without any manipulation required. He had fled from his brother's anger, uncertain if any place would be safe. Now God promised to be with him wherever he went. He had left behind the land that was supposed to be his inheritance. Now God promised he would return. He had stolen a blessing intended for another. Now God confirmed that the blessing was legitimately his, not because of how he had obtained it, but because of God's sovereign choice made before his birth. The dream did not excuse Jacob's deception, but it transcended it. God's purposes were larger than Jacob's schemes, and God's grace was greater than Jacob's sin. There is something almost scandalous about this divine visitation. The rabbis of later generations would debate why God appeared to such a flawed man at such a compromised moment. Some suggested that Jacob had repented during his journey, that his heart had been softened by his exile. Others proposed that God was honouring the faith of Abraham and Isaac, rather than any merit in Jacob himself. Still others saw in this episode a profound revelation of divine character. God does not wait for us to become worthy before he speaks. He meets us in our failure, addresses us in our fear, reveals himself when we have done nothing to deserve revelation. Grace, by definition, is unearned. The dream came to Jacob at the lowest point of his life, not at a moment of spiritual triumph, but at a moment of spiritual crisis. He was not in the temple, but in the wilderness. He was not at prayer, but fleeing from danger. He was not righteous, but guilty, not faithful, but frightened, not seeking God, but simply trying to survive. Yet this was precisely when heaven opened. This was when the ladder appeared. This was when the Lord spoke. The pattern would repeat throughout Scripture, God appearing to Moses in the wilderness, calling David from the sheepfolds, commissioning Gideon while he hid from enemies, speaking to Elijah in a cave of despair. The ladder of Jacob's dream was not just a structure but a statement. Heaven reaches down to earth, not because earth reaches up to heaven. The night deepened and the vision held. We do not know how long Jacob remained in this state of revelation, suspended between sleeping and waking, beholding wonders that human language could barely describe. The angels continued their ascending and descending. The ladder blazed with light. The voice of God echoed with promises that would outlast empires. And somewhere in the sleeping mind of the fugitive, something began to shift. The young man who had grasped at blessings was being grasped by the blesser. The schemer who had manipulated his way to prominence was being drawn into a story far larger than his schemes could ever have imagined. The supplanter was being claimed, named, and commissioned by the only one whose purposes cannot be supplanted. The dream would end, as all dreams must. Jacob would wake to find himself still in the wilderness, still sleeping on a stone, still facing a 500-mile journey with nothing but the clothes on his back. Nothing in his external circumstances would have changed, but everything in his internal world would be different. He had gone to sleep a fugitive. He would wake as something else, not yet transformed, not yet worthy, of the promises spoken over him, but no longer alone, never again alone. The God who had revealed himself in the night would be with him in the morning, and in every morning that followed, until the promises were fulfilled and the fugitive returned home. The angels ascended with their reports. New ones descended with their instructions. The ladder stood firm between worlds, and Jacob, dreaming on his stone pillow, received more than he could ever have hoped for, more than he could ever have schemed for, more than he could ever have understood. Heaven had touched earth, and nothing would ever be the same. Jacob awoke with a start, his heart pounding against his ribs, his breath coming in short gasps. The first grey light of dawn was spreading across the eastern horizon, painting the wilderness in shades of silver and rose. The stone beneath his head was still cold, still hard, still utterly ordinary. The ground where he lay was the same rocky terrain he had collapsed upon the night before. Nothing in the physical landscape had changed. The same scrub brush, the same scattered boulders, the same empty expanse stretching in every direction. Yet Jacob knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed. He had seen what human eyes were never meant to see. He had heard what human ears could scarcely comprehend. And the words that fell from his lips in that moment of waking would echo through the centuries as one of the most profound declarations of religious experience ever uttered. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." The statement was simple, almost childlike in its directness, yet it contained a revolution in understanding. Jacob had grown up in a household where God was worshipped, where the stories of Abraham's encounters with the Almighty were told and retold, where the covenant promises were cherished and passed down. But he had apparently believed, as many in the ancient world believed, that divine presence was localized, that the God of his fathers dwelt in particular places and could be left behind when one traveled beyond those boundaries. He had fled Canaan thinking he was fleeing not just from Esau but perhaps from God himself, entering a spiritual no man's land where the promises of Abraham held no power. Now he understood his error. The Lord was here. The Lord had been here all along. The Lord would be wherever Jacob went, not because Jacob carried him, but because there was no place in all creation beyond the reach of his presence. The realization struck Jacob with force that went beyond mere intellectual acknowledgement. The Hebrew text tells us he was afraid. Yah, a word that encompasses terror, awe, reverence, and wonder all at once. This was not the cowering fear of a man before an enemy, but the numinous dread of a creature suddenly aware that he stands in the presence of the holy. Rudolf Otto, the great scholar of religious experience, would later describe this sensation as the mysterium tremendum, the overwhelming encounter with that which is wholly other, utterly beyond human comprehension, simultaneously terrifying and fascinating. Jacob had experienced the mysterium tremendum in the night, and now, in the morning light, he trembled with the aftershock. "How awesome is this place," he declared. "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." The words reveal the depth of transformation occurring in Jacob's perception. This unremarkable patch of wilderness, this place he had stumbled upon simply because his strength had given out, was now revealed as something sacred. Not a random campsite, but the house of God. Not merely a spot on the road to Haran, but the gate of heaven, the threshold between worlds, the place where the ladder touched down and angels passed between realms. Jacob was not speaking metaphorically. In his understanding, shaped by the vision of the night, this ground had become holy ground. The veil between visible and invisible had grown thin here. Heaven had touched earth at this precise location, and the place would never be ordinary again. The young man who had schemed for blessings now responded to genuine blessing with acts of consecration. He took the stone that had served as his pillow, that uncomfortable, unyielding rock that had supported his head through the most significant night of his life, and set it up as a pillar. The act was laden with meaning. Throughout the ancient Near East, standing stones served as markers, witnesses, memorials of significant events. They were tangible reminders in a world without written records, physical testimonies that something important had happened in this place. But Jacob did more than simply erect a marker. He poured oil on top of the stone, consecrating it, setting it apart from the ordinary stones that littered the landscape. The oil transformed the pillar from mere memorial to sacred object, from reminder to altar. Then Jacob did something unprecedented. He renamed the place. It had been called Luz, a Canaanite name meaning almond tree, as ordinary and unmemorable as the settlement nearby. But Jacob declared it Bethel. Beth-El, literally house of God. The name change was an act of spiritual cartography, remaking the landscape according to divine encounter rather than human geography. This was no longer Luz, a forgettable spot on the road north. This was Bethel, the place where God had appeared, where heaven had opened, where a fugitive had been claimed by the Almighty. The name would endure for millennia. Long after Jacob was dust, long after the pillar he erected had crumbled, Bethel would remain one of the most sacred sites in Israel's memory, a place of worship, prophecy, and encounter with the living God. But Jacob's response to the vision was not yet complete. Having erected his pillar and named his holy place, he now made a vow, and the vow reveals both how far he had come and how far he still had to go. "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house, and of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you." The vow was remarkable in its specificity. Jacob was promising to acknowledge the Lord as his God, to maintain Bethel as a sacred site, and to tithe a tenth of everything he received. These were significant commitments, expressions of genuine gratitude and emerging devotion. The tithe in particular would become a foundational practice in Israelite worship, one of the earliest recorded instances of voluntary giving as an expression of covenant relationship. Yet the vow also reveals the persistence of Jacob's calculating nature. Notice the conditional structure. If God will be with me, if he will keep me, if he will provide food and clothing, if I return safely, then the Lord shall be my God. Jacob was bargaining. He had just received unconditional promises from the Almighty: land, descendants, blessing, presence. And his response was to set conditions. He had witnessed angels ascending and descending, heard the voice of God himself, and yet he could not quite release his grip on the transaction, could not fully surrender to grace without trying to negotiate terms. This should not surprise us, nor should it lead us to judge Jacob too harshly. Transformation is rarely instantaneous. The habits of a lifetime do not dissolve in a single night, however luminous that night might be. Jacob had spent his entire life grasping his brother's heel, grasping the birthright, grasping the blessing through deception. The instinct to grab, to secure, to make certain through his own efforts was woven into his very identity. It would take years, decades, of divine work to reshape him into a man who could receive without calculating, who could trust without conditions, who could rest in God's promises without trying to supplement them with his own schemes. The beauty of the Bethel encounter lies precisely in this tension between divine grace and human limitation. God did not wait for Jacob to become a man of unconditional faith before appearing to him. He did not demand that Jacob first learn to trust before offering promises. He came to Jacob as Jacob was, scheming, conditional, bargaining even in his worship, and began the long work of transformation. The ladder was not a reward for Jacob's virtue. It was an intervention of grace into Jacob's brokenness. The promises were not earned but given, not deserved but bestowed. And the vow, with all its conditions and calculations, was received by a God patient enough to work with imperfect responses, generous enough to honour halting steps toward faith. There is profound theology embedded in this moment. The God who had been the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac was becoming, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, the God of Jacob. Not just an inherited deity, not just a family tradition, not just the subject of second-hand stories, but a God personally encountered, personally addressed, personally claimed. The transition from the God of my fathers to my God is one of the most significant journeys any human being can make. It is the difference between knowing about God and knowing God, between religious heritage and living faith, between theology learned and theology lived. Jacob was taking his first stumbling steps on that journey. The symbolism of the ladder would resonate through centuries of interpretation. For Jewish mystics, it represented the connection between earthly action and heavenly consequence. Every deed below sending reverberations above, every prayer ascending the rungs to the throne of God. For Christian interpreters, the ladder foreshadowed Christ himself, who would later tell Nathanael, "Truly, truly I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." In this reading, Jesus is the true ladder, the ultimate bridge between God and humanity, the one in whom heaven and earth are finally and permanently joined. The dream at Bethel was not just about Jacob's personal encounter, but about the shape of redemption itself, God reaching down, making a way, opening a gate that no human effort could ever unlock. For Jacob himself, standing in the morning light beside his oil-anointed pillar, the full meaning of the dream was still unfolding. He understood that he had encountered the living God. He understood that this place was sacred, that the ground beneath his feet was holy. He understood that promises had been made, that his future had been addressed, that he was no longer wandering in a universe empty of divine presence. But he did not yet understand how those promises would be fulfilled, what struggles lay ahead, how thoroughly God intended to remake him before the journey was complete. The stone pillar stood as witness to what had happened in the night. Bethel now had its name, its marker, its story to tell future generations, and Jacob, the supplanter, the schemer, the fugitive, gathered his few possessions and prepared to continue his journey toward Haran. He was still the same man in many ways, still carrying the guilt of his deception, still facing the uncertainty of exile, still prone to bargaining and calculation. But he was also different. He had seen the ladder. He had heard the voice. He had received promises that no amount of scheming could ever have secured. The road stretched onward toward the east, toward Laban's household, toward years of labour and struggle that Jacob could not yet imagine. But now he walked with something he had not possessed the day before, the assurance of divine presence. "I am with you," God had said, "and will keep you wherever you go." The words were a lamp for the dark stretches ahead, a certainty to hold when circumstances grew uncertain, a promise that would be tested and proven through decades of wandering. Jacob left Bethel and set his face toward the land of the people of the east. The house of God receded behind him, but the God of the house went with him. The gate of heaven remained at that sacred spot, but heaven itself travelled alongside the fugitive, as close as his next breath, as constant as the beating of his heart. He did not yet know it fully, would not know it fully for many years, but he would never be alone again. The supplanter was becoming a sojourner. The schemer was becoming a seeker. And somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, a well waited where he would see the face that would change his life forever. And a household waited that would teach him what it meant to be deceived. And a river waited where he would wrestle through the night for a blessing he no longer had to steal. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Jacob walked east, carrying promises he barely understood, nursing a faith still tangled with calculation, following a God he was only beginning to know. The stone pillar of Bethel stood behind him in the morning light, anointed and named, testifying to the night when a runaway discovered he was running not from God but toward him. The journey from Bethel to Haran stretched across weeks of travel through unfamiliar territory, but Jacob moved now with a lightness he had not possessed before. The vision of the ladder had not erased his circumstances. He was still a fugitive, still poor, still uncertain of his reception. But it had transformed his inner landscape. The God of Abraham and Isaac had spoken to him directly, had promised presence and protection, had declared that his future held blessing rather than curse. The young man who had fled Beersheba in terror now walked toward Haran with something approaching hope. The text of Genesis marks his arrival with an almost cinematic flourish. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. The Hebrew literally reads that Jacob lifted his feet, an idiom suggesting renewed energy, purposeful movement, the stride of a man who knows where he is going and why. The promised land lay behind him now, but the promise maker travelled with him, and that made all the difference. He came upon a well in the open country, and around it 3 flocks of sheep lay waiting with their shepherds. Wells were precious resources in the ancient Near East, carefully maintained and jealously guarded. They were also natural gathering places, sites of commerce, conversation and community. It was at a well that Abraham's servant had found Rebekah, Jacob's own mother, decades earlier. Now history was rhyming, and another encounter at a well was about to reshape the story of Abraham's family. Jacob approached the shepherds with questions, seeking information about his destination and his uncle. "My brothers, where do you come from?" The address was warm, familiar, the greeting of a man raised in pastoral culture who knew how to speak to fellow keepers of flocks. They answered that they came from Haran, the very city Jacob sought. His heart must have quickened. "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" They knew him, and then, with timing that seemed almost orchestrated by an unseen hand, they added, "See, Rachel his daughter is coming with the sheep." Jacob turned, and there she was, Rachel, whose name meant "ewe," approaching the well with her father's flock. The text does not describe her appearance in detail, saving that information for later, but something in that first glimpse struck Jacob with the force of revelation. Later we will learn that Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance, that her loveliness was the kind that caught every eye and held it. But perhaps what moved Jacob in that initial moment was something beyond physical beauty, the recognition of family, the sense of destiny converging. The echo of his mother's stories about her brother's household now made flesh in this young woman walking toward him across the fields. What happened next revealed a Jacob transformed by more than just the vision at Bethel. The great stone covering the well's mouth typically required multiple shepherds to move, a safety measure that prevented contamination and ensured that water was distributed fairly among the various flocks. But when Jacob saw Rachel approaching, he strode to the well and rolled the stone away single-handedly. The feat demonstrated remarkable strength, but more than that, it demonstrated a man suddenly energized by purpose, eager to serve, wanting to clear obstacles from the path of this woman he had not yet even spoken to. The schemer, who had always calculated advantage, was acting from impulse, from generosity, from something that looked remarkably like love. He watered Laban's flock, Rachel's flock, performing the servant's task without being asked, without negotiating payment, without any of the conditional thinking that had characterized his dealings with Esau and Isaac. Then he approached Rachel, kissed her in the customary greeting of kinship, and wept aloud. The tears were complex: relief at having completed his long journey, joy at finding family in a foreign land, perhaps the overwhelming emotion of a man who had been alone for weeks, suddenly confronted with connection and belonging. He told her who he was, Rebekah's son, her father's nephew, her own cousin. Rachel ran to tell her father, and soon Laban himself was rushing out to meet this unexpected visitor, embracing him, welcoming him into his home with the words, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." For a month Jacob stayed with Laban's household, and during that month he worked, not as a guest but as a member of the family, contributing his labour to the flocks and the fields. He had arrived with nothing, a fugitive without wealth or possessions, but he had the skills, learned in his father's tents, the knowledge of animal husbandry that made him valuable, and he had fallen irretrievably in love with Rachel. The depth of Jacob's love for Rachel is one of the great romantic threads in Scripture. When Laban asked what wages Jacob wanted for his continued service, the young man's answer was immediate and extravagant. "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel." 7 years. An enormous commitment. A bride price paid not in silver or livestock, but in time, in labour, in the prime years of a young man's life. The offer revealed both the intensity of Jacob's love and his desperate circumstances. He had nothing else to give. His inheritance was a spoken blessing, not tangible wealth. All he possessed was his strength, his skill, and his years, and he was willing to pour all of these out for the woman he loved. Laban agreed, and so began 7 years of labour that the text describes with breathtaking economy. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. The words capture something true about the nature of love, its power to transform the experience of time, to make burdens feel light, to sustain hope through seasons of waiting. Day after day, month after month, year after year, Jacob tended Laban's flocks, built Laban's wealth, served Laban's interests, and through it all, the thought of Rachel made the labour sweet. But Jacob had entered the household of a man whose capacity for deception matched his own, and the deceiver was about to be deceived. When the 7 years were complete, Jacob went to Laban to claim his bride. "Give me my wife," he said, "that I may go in to her, for my time is completed." Laban prepared a wedding feast, gathering all the people of the place for a celebration that lasted into the night. Wine flowed freely, lamps burned low, and when darkness had fallen and the festivities concluded, Laban brought a veiled woman to Jacob's tent. In the darkness, in the haze of celebration, Jacob consummated his marriage to the woman he believed was Rachel. Morning brought horror. The woman beside him was not Rachel, but Leah, Rachel's older sister, the one the text describes as having weak or tender eyes, in contrast to Rachel's striking beauty. Jacob had spent 7 years working for the younger daughter, and Laban had given him the older one instead. The deception was complete, the marriage legally binding, the wrong irreversible. Jacob's confrontation with Laban dripped with outrage. "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" But Laban's response cut to the bone with its implicit rebuke. "It is not so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn." The words must have landed like a physical blow. The younger before the firstborn. Jacob had manipulated his way to receiving the blessing meant for his older brother. Now he had been manipulated into marrying the older sister instead of the younger. The heel grabber had been tripped by his own tactics. The supplanter had been supplanted. What he had sowed with Esau, he was now reaping with Laban. Yet there was no escape, no way to undo what had been done. Laban offered a path forward. Complete the bridal week with Leah, then marry Rachel as well, in exchange for another 7 years of labour. Jacob agreed. What choice did he have? And within a week found himself husband to 2 sisters, bound to 14 years of service to a father-in-law who had proven himself a master manipulator. The household that emerged from this tangled beginning was marked by rivalry, heartache, and the slow working of divine purpose through deeply flawed human relationships. Leah, the unloved wife, bore Jacob's sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, each name carrying the weight of her desperate longing for her husband's affection. "Surely now my husband will love me," she said when Reuben was born, "because the Lord has heard that I am hated," she said at Simeon's birth. The names were prayers and laments, testimonies to a woman trapped in a marriage that had never wanted her. Rachel, the beloved wife, remained barren, watching her sister's womb produce child after child, while her own remained empty. The irony was bitter. She had Jacob's love but not his children. Leah had his children but not his love. The 2 sisters competed through childbearing, through their servants Bilhah and Zilpah, through mandrakes and bargains and the desperate arithmetic of a household where affection was currency and children were wealth. From this cauldron of jealousy and longing came the 12 sons who would become the tribes of Israel, a nation born not from harmony, but from struggle, not from peace, but from the same kind of wrestling that had characterized Jacob's life from the womb. Through all of this, God was at work. The text notes repeatedly that it was the Lord who opened Leah's womb, the Lord who saw her affliction, the Lord who heard her cries. When Rachel finally conceived, it was because God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Joseph's birth, the son Jacob had longed for from his beloved wife, was divine gift, not natural occurrence. The God who had appeared at Bethel, who had promised to be with Jacob wherever he went, was fulfilling that promise in the most intimate dimensions of Jacob's life, even when Jacob himself may have been too consumed by the drama of his household to notice. 20 years Jacob spent in Laban's service, 20 years of labour, of manipulation and counter-manipulation, of growing wealth and growing family and growing tension. Laban changed Jacob's wages 10 times, always seeking advantage, but God prospered Jacob regardless. The schemer was learning what it meant to be schemed against. The deceiver was discovering the taste of deception. And slowly, imperceptibly, the man who had grasped at blessings was being shaped into someone capable of receiving them. The years in Haran were Jacob's crucible. The fire was hot, the betrayal of the wedding night, the rivalry between his wives, the constant manoeuvring of Laban, the exhausting labour under sun and frost. But crucibles produce refinement, and Jacob was being refined. The young man who had fled Canaan was not the same man who would eventually return. The supplanter was learning humility. The schemer was developing patience. The grabber was slowly, painfully being taught to open his hands. And through it all, the dream of Bethel hovered in memory, the ladder reaching to heaven, the angels ascending and descending, the voice of God promising presence and return. "I will bring you back to this land," God had said. Jacob clung to that promise through the long years of exile, through the seasons of toil and the nights of tension, through the accumulation of wives and children and livestock. The promise was an anchor, a fixed point in a world of shifting alliances and uncertain futures. When the time came to leave Haran, it was God who spoke. "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." The same God who had sent him forth was now calling him back. The exile was ending. The sojourner was becoming a returner, and the man who had left Canaan alone, with nothing but a staff in his hand, would return with 2 wives, 2 servants, 11 sons, a daughter, and flocks beyond counting. But between Haran and home lay one more obstacle, One more night of wrestling, one more transformation yet to come. Jacob would return to Canaan, but not before he faced the brother he'd wronged, and not before he faced the God who had been shaping him all along. The departure from Haran was neither clean nor peaceful. Laban pursued Jacob's caravan for 7 days after discovering his flight, catching up with them in the hill country of Gilead. There were accusations. Jacob had fled secretly, Laban complained, stealing away like a thief in the night, not even allowing him to kiss his grandchildren goodbye. There was the matter of household gods that Rachel had taken without Jacob's knowledge, hidden beneath her saddle while she claimed the indisposition of women to avoid her father's search. There were heated words and wounded pride and the peculiar grief of families who have wronged each other too many times to part cleanly. But in the end, they made a covenant, set up a pillar of witness, shared a meal, and went their separate ways. Laban returned to Haran. Jacob continued toward Canaan. 20 years of complicated history receded into the distance with each step. But if Jacob thought the hardest part of his journey was behind him, he was gravely mistaken. As his caravan moved south toward the Promised Land, messengers brought news that turned his blood to ice. Esau was coming to meet him, and he was bringing 400 men. 400 men, not a welcoming party but an army. Not a delegation of reconciliation, but what appeared to be a force of retribution. 20 years had passed since Jacob had fled his brother's murderous rage. 20 years since Esau had comforted himself with plans of fratricide. Jacob had hoped, perhaps naively, that time might have softened his brother's anger, that the intervening decades might have dimmed the memory of stolen blessings and deceived fathers. But 400 men suggested otherwise. 400 men suggested that Esau had been nursing his grievance all these years, building his strength, waiting for the day when Jacob would return and justice could finally be served. The text tells us that Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. The Hebrew words convey more than simple fear. They suggest a splitting, a dividing of the self, a terror so profound it fractured his composure. This was the moment he had been dreading since the night he fled Beersheba with his father's blessing still warm on his head and his brother's cry still ringing in his ears. Now it had arrived. The reckoning he had postponed for 2 decades was finally at hand. Jacob's response to the crisis revealed both his growth and his lingering tendency towards self-reliance. He divided his company into 2 camps. The Hebrew word is Mahaneh, from which comes the name Mahanaim that he had given to this region, after angels had met him on the way. His reasoning was pragmatic. If Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. It was the calculation of a man who had not forgotten how to scheme, how to plan for contingencies, how to hedge his bets against disaster. But then Jacob did something he had rarely done before, something that marked how far he had travelled from the young man who had bargained with God at Bethel. He prayed, and the prayer that poured from his lips was unlike anything we have heard from him previously. O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. The prayer was a masterpiece of spiritual maturity. Jacob began by acknowledging the God of his fathers, the covenant relationship that grounded his appeal. He reminded God of the divine command to return, placing his current danger in the context of obedience rather than foolishness. Then came the confession that would have been impossible for the young Jacob. I am not worthy. The supplanter, the schemer, the man who had always grabbed for what he believed he deserved, now acknowledged that he deserved nothing. The blessings he had received, the wealth, the family, the survival of 20 years in Laban's household, were not his achievement, but God's gift. With only my staff I crossed this Jordan. He had left with nothing. Everything he now possessed was grace. The prayer continued with honest fear. I fear him, and with specific request. Deliver me. Protect the mothers and children. but it concluded not with demands, but with reminder. You said. Jacob was holding God to his own promises, not presuming upon divine favour, but appealing to divine faithfulness. This was no longer bargaining. This was wrestling with God through prayer, clinging to covenant commitments, pleading the character of the one who had appeared at Bethel and promised never to leave. Having prayed, Jacob also acted. He selected from his vast flocks an enormous gift for Esau: 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels with their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. The gift was staggering in its generosity, calculated to overwhelm Esau's anger with wave after wave of arriving livestock. Jacob sent the animals ahead in separate droves, each attended by servants instructed to tell Esau, "They belong to your servant Jacob. It is a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us." The strategy was pure Jacob, meticulous, layered, designed to soften his brother's heart through repetition and abundance. I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, Jacob thought, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. That night Jacob sent his family across the ford of the Jabbok, a tributary of the Jordan whose name in Hebrew sounds remarkably like his own. Yaakov crossing the Jabbok. It was as if he had come to a place that bore his identity, a river whose very name marked it as the site of reckoning. His wives crossed over, his children, his servants, everything he possessed. Jacob remained alone on the northern bank, facing the darkness, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. And then, in that solitude, something happened that would change everything. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. The text is deliberately mysterious about the identity of this figure. He appears without introduction, without explanation, simply materializing in the darkness to engage Jacob in physical combat. The wrestling lasted through the entire night, hour after hour of grappling, straining, two figures locked in struggle while the stars wheeled overhead and the river murmured below. This was not a brief scuffle, but an exhausting, all-consuming contest that pushed both combatants to their limits. Who was this mysterious opponent? The text calls him simply a man. Yet Jacob will later declare that he saw God face to face. The prophet Hosea, centuries later, will say that Jacob strove with the angel and prevailed. The ambiguity seems intentional. This was an encounter that defied easy categorization, a meeting with someone who was human enough to wrestle physically, yet divine enough to wound with a touch, and bless with authority. Theologians have long identified this figure as a theophany, a physical manifestation of God himself, perhaps the pre-incarnate Christ appearing to Jacob in tangible form. The wrestling continued until the first grey light of dawn began to spread across the eastern horizon. And when the mysterious figure saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. The touch was supernatural, a mere contact that dislocated bone from socket, that transformed Jacob in an instant from a man wrestling as an equal to a man clinging in desperate dependence. The wound was permanent. Jacob would limp for the rest of his life. Every step he took from this moment forward would remind him of this night, this struggle, this encounter with the divine. But even wounded, Jacob would not release his grip. "Let me go," the figure said, "for the day is broken." And Jacob's response revealed how thoroughly he had been transformed. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." 20 years earlier, Jacob had stolen a blessing through deception. Goatskins on his hands, lies on his lips, his blind father's confusion exploited for personal gain. Now he was demanding a blessing through tenacity, through refusal to let go, through the desperate clinging of a man who knew he was outmatched but would not surrender. The old Jacob grabbed blessings from unwitting victims. The new Jacob clung to God himself, refusing to release his hold even when wounded, even when commanded to let go. The figure's response was a question. "What is your name?" The question reached deeper than simple identification. It was an invitation to confession, a demand for honest self-assessment. In the ancient world, names carried identity, destiny, character. To state one's name was to acknowledge one's nature, and Jacob, Yaakov, bore a name that meant supplanter, deceiver. heel grabber. To answer the question honestly was to admit what he had been, what he had done, who he was at his core. "Jacob," he said. The word was confession and surrender. "I am the supplanter, I am the schemer, I am the one who has grasped and manipulated and deceived his way through life." The pretense was over. The masks were stripped away. In the presence of his divine opponent, Jacob told the truth about himself. And then came the blessing he had clung for. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." The name change was everything. Jacob, supplanter, was being retired, replaced by Israel, a name that meant he strives with God, or God strives. The old identity, forged in the womb when a grasping hand shot out to grab a brother's heel, was being superseded by a new identity, forged in the struggle of this night. Jacob's nature, his tendency to wrestle, to cling, to refuse to let go, was not erased but redeemed. The same tenacity that had made him a deceiver was transformed into the tenacity that made him a prevailer with God. His flaw became his glory, his wrestling became his worship. Jacob asked for the man's name in return, but the question was deflected. "Why is it that you ask my name?" The answer was unnecessary. Jacob already knew who he had been fighting. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Peniel, the face of God. Another sacred site, another place of encounter, another stone marker in the spiritual geography of Jacob's life. Bethel had been the house of God. Peniel was the face of God. The ladder had shown him heaven's gate. The wrestling had brought him to heaven's presence. The sun rose as Jacob crossed back over the Jabbok, and he was limping because of his hip. The wound was visible, undeniable, a physical testament to what had happened in the night. The man who'd always relied on his own strength now walked with a permanent reminder of his weakness. The schemer who had outmaneuvered everyone from his brother to his father-in-law now bore in his body the evidence that he had met someone who could not be outmaneuvered. The limp was his trophy, his mark of transformation, his perpetual call to humility. He looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men. Everything Jacob had feared, everything he had prepared for, everything he had prayed about was now approaching across the plain. He arranged his family in order, the servants and their children first, Leah and her children next, Rachel and Joseph last, the beloved protected by the less beloved. Then Jacob himself went on ahead, putting his own body between his family and whatever danger awaited. He bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother, the complete obeisance of a subject before a king, the physical demonstration of the blessing that had declared Esau would serve Jacob now reversed in humble gesture. And then Esau ran, not toward Jacob with sword drawn, not with rage unleashed after 20 years of nursing grievance, but running to embrace, running to meet, running with the eagerness of a brother who had somehow found it in his heart to forgive. Esau ran to him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. The moment was one of the most unexpected reversals in Scripture. Everything had pointed toward confrontation. The 400 men, Jacob's elaborate preparations, the division of camps, the gifts sent ahead, the desperate prayer. And instead there was reconciliation. Instead of the sword, an embrace. Instead of revenge, tears of reunion. What had happened in Esau's heart during the 20 years of separation? The text does not say. Perhaps he had prospered enough that the birthright's loss no longer stung. Perhaps time had simply softened anger into acceptance. Perhaps, and this seems most likely, God had been at work in Esau's heart just as he had been at work in Jacob's, preparing both brothers for this moment, orchestrating reconciliation that neither could have achieved on their own. Jacob, limping, embracing his brother through tears, had finally faced what he had fled. The deceiver had confessed his name. The supplanter had received a new identity. The man who had run from Esau's rage now stood in Esau's arms. The journey that began with a stolen blessing had arrived at unexpected grace. Israel, the one who strives with God, had prevailed, not through scheming but through surrender, not through deception but through desperate clinging, not through his own strength but through the blessing that came only when he acknowledged his weakness. The sun was fully risen now, illuminating a scene that neither brother could have imagined 2 decades earlier. The past was not erased. Jacob would always bear the limp, would always carry the memory of what he had done, but the future was open. The promised land lay before him. The covenant continued through him, and the God who had appeared at Bethel, who had wrestled with him at Peniel, was calling him home. The brothers parted in peace, each returning to his own territory. Esau to Seir in the south, Jacob to settle for a time near Shechem in the heart of Canaan. The reunion had been more than Jacob dared hope for, a gift of grace that he had not earned and could not have engineered. But if he thought the hardest parts of his journey were behind him, the years ahead would prove otherwise. Tragedy awaited him in Canaan, violence at Shechem involving his daughter Dinah, and the terrible revenge exacted by his sons Simeon and Levi, events that brought shame upon his household and danger from the surrounding peoples. The promised land was proving to be a complicated inheritance, and Jacob found himself once again in a place of fear and uncertainty. It was in this moment of crisis that God spoke again. "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Bethel. The word must have struck Jacob's heart like a bell ringing across the years. Bethel, the place where he had slept on a stone and dreamed of a ladder. Bethel, where angels had ascended and descended, and the voice of God had spoken promises that seemed impossible. Bethel, where a terrified fugitive had been met by grace he did not deserve, and given a future he could not have imagined. More than 20 years had passed since that night. Jacob had travelled to Haran, laboured for Laban, married 2 sisters, fathered 12 sons and a daughter, accumulated wealth beyond counting, wrestled with God at Peniel, and reconciled with Esau. And now, God was calling him back to where it all began. The command to return to Bethel was more than geographical direction. It was a summons to remembrance, to worship, to the completion of a spiritual circuit that had been left open for 2 decades. Jacob had made a vow at Bethel, a conditional promise that if God would be with him and bring him safely home, then the Lord would be his God. God had kept his side of the covenant. He had been with Jacob in Haran, had protected him from Laban's schemes, had prospered him despite every obstacle, had brought him back to Canaan, had reconciled him with Esau. Now it was time for Jacob to keep his side, to return to Bethel, to acknowledge publicly what he had promised privately, to make the Lord his God not just in word but in deed. But before Jacob could approach that sacred place, something had to change. His household had accumulated more than wealth during the years in Haran. Foreign gods had crept in. The household idols Rachel had stolen from Laban, the pagan objects acquired from Shechem, the religious artifacts of a family that had lived too long among peoples who did not worship the God of Abraham. These objects represented divided loyalties, hedged bets, the persistent human tendency to keep options open rather than committing wholly to one path. Jacob gathered his household and spoke with an authority he had not always possessed. "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." The words marked a watershed. Jacob was no longer bargaining, no longer calculating, no longer keeping alternative deities in reserve in case the God of his fathers proved insufficient. He was calling his household to exclusive worship, to the kind of undivided devotion that had characterized Abraham at his best. The foreign gods were surrendered, handed over to Jacob and buried under the oak near Shechem, hidden in the earth where they could no longer compete for the family's allegiance. Earrings too were buried, perhaps because they bore pagan symbols or had been used in idol worship. The household was being purified, set apart, prepared to encounter the holy God at his holy place. They changed their garments, an external sign of internal transformation, the shedding of old identities as they prepared to take on renewed covenant commitment. And then they arose and journeyed toward Bethel, the entire caravan moving through a land that might have been hostile but was not. A terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, the text notes, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. The same God who had promised to be with Jacob wherever he went was now clearing the path for his return, holding back enemies, creating space for worship. They arrived at Bethel, the place Jacob had named so many years before, the site of the stone pillar and the oil and the vow. And there Jacob built an altar, fulfilling at last the promise he had made as a young man fleeing for his life. He called the place El Bethel, the God of Bethel, a name that shifted focus from the location to the person. It was not the place that mattered ultimately, sacred though it had become. It was the God who had revealed himself there, the God who had appeared to a deceiver and spoken promises of grace, the God who had kept every word through 20 years of wandering. And then, as if to confirm that Jacob's long journey of faith had reached its destination, God appeared to him again. The same God who had stood above the ladder, who had spoken promises into the darkness of that desperate night, now appeared in the daylight to a man transformed. "Your name is Jacob," God said, "but your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." The renaming that had occurred at Peniel was now confirmed at Bethel, the new identity ratified at the very place where the old identity had first been addressed. The supplanter had become Israel. The schemer had become a prince with God. God continued, and his words echoed the ancient promises made to Abraham and Isaac, now passed finally and fully to Jacob. "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." The promises were comprehensive: fruitfulness, nationhood, royalty, land. Everything God had declared over Abraham generations earlier was now declared over Jacob. Everything spoken at the first Bethel encounter was now reaffirmed and expanded. The conditional vow Jacob had made, "If God will be with me, then the Lord shall be my God," had been answered with unconditional commitment. God had been with him. God had kept him. God had given him bread to eat and clothing to wear. God had brought him back in peace. And now God was sealing the covenant with renewed promises and renewed presence. Jacob responded as he had responded before, with a pillar with oil with the naming of sacred space. But there was a depth to his worship now that had not existed in the frightened young man of 20 years earlier. He had lived the promises. He had experienced the faithfulness. He had been wrestled into surrender and transformed through struggle. The pillar he set up at Bethel was not the gesture of a man hoping God would prove true. It was the testimony of a man who knew, from decades of experience, that God was true. But if Jacob hoped that his return to Bethel marked the end of suffering, the days that followed shattered that illusion. As they journeyed from Bethel toward Ephrath, Rachel, the beloved wife, the one for whom he had laboured 14 years, the mother of Joseph, went into labour with her second child. The birth was hard, brutally hard, and it became clear that Rachel would not survive it. With her last breaths, she named the baby Benoni, son of my sorrow. Then she died, and Jacob buried her there on the road to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. The grief was staggering. Rachel had been the love of his life, the face he had seen at the well that first day in Haran, the woman whose beauty and presence had sustained him through years of Laban's manipulation. Now she was gone, her grave marked by a pillar that stood as testament to love and loss. Jacob renamed the baby Benjamin, son of my right hand, refusing to let the child carry the weight of sorrow as his identity. But the sorrow remained, a wound that would never fully heal, a reminder that blessing and grief often walk together in this broken world. More loss followed. Jacob came at last to his father Isaac at Mamre near Hebron, in the land where Abraham had lived. Isaac was still alive, the old man who had blessed Jacob under deception, who had sent him to Haran with a second blessing freely given, who had lived long enough to see his wayward son return. Isaac was 180 years old when he breathed his last and his sons buried him. Both sons, Esau and Jacob together, the brothers who had been divided by blessing and deception, standing side by side at their father's grave. The reconciliation that had occurred on the plain years earlier was confirmed in this shared act of mourning. The family torn apart in part one of this story was reunited at its end, at least for this solemn moment. The burial of Isaac by both his sons was a quiet miracle of grace. Nothing in the early story would have predicted this outcome. The stolen blessing, the murderous rage, the flight into exile, all of it had pointed toward permanent fracture, toward a family forever broken by deception and its consequences. But God's purposes were larger than human sin, and divine patience had worked transformation in both brothers. Esau had found it in his heart to forgive. Jacob had learned humility through years of being deceived himself, and now they stood together, laying their father to rest, living proof that reconciliation was possible even when betrayal had cut to the bone. Jacob, Israel, would live on for many years, through more tragedy and more grace. He would lose Joseph, or think he had lost him, and grieve for decades over a blood-stained coat. He would discover Joseph alive in Egypt and migrate with his entire family to escape famine. He would bless Pharaoh and bless his sons, and at the end of his life, bless his 12 sons with prophecies that would shape their tribes for generations. He would ask to be buried not in Egypt, but in the cave of Machpelah, with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Leah, the family burial ground in the Promised Land, the land he had been promised in the dream at Bethel. But on that day, at Bethel, with the altar freshly built and the pillar standing and the name El Bethel echoing in the air, Jacob stood as living testimony to the faithfulness of God. The young man who had fled with nothing but a staff now stood as patriarch of a great family. The deceiver who had stolen his brother's blessing now walked in blessing honestly received. The schemer who had bargained with God at this very spot now worshipped with undivided heart. The transformation was not complete. It never is, this side of eternity, but it was real. God had kept his word. Every promise spoken over that stone pillow had been fulfilled, or was in process of fulfillment. The land would be his descendants. The offspring would become a nation. The blessing would flow through his line to all families of the earth. The ladder that Jacob had seen in his dream, that stairway between heaven and earth, crowded with ascending and descending angels, was more than a personal vision. It was a glimpse of cosmic reality, a revelation of how God works in the world. Heaven and earth are not separate realms, disconnected and indifferent to each other. They are joined. There is traffic between them. Angels ascend and descend, carrying prayers and returning with answers, bearing reports and bringing instructions. And at the top of the ladder, or beside the dreamer, or both, stands the Lord himself, not distant but near, not silent but speaking, not indifferent but intimately involved in the lives of wanderers and fugitives and deceivers who somehow become patriarchs and princes. Centuries later, a rabbi from Nazareth would speak to a man named Nathanael about greater things to come. "Truly, truly, I say to you," Jesus declared, "you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." In that single sentence, the meaning of Jacob's ladder reached its fullest expression. The true connection between heaven and earth was not a structure, but a person. The bridge across the infinite chasm was not a stairway, but a saviour. Jesus himself was the ladder. God descending to humanity, humanity ascending to God, the two natures joined in one person who would reconcile all things through his blood. Jacob's dream, then, was not just about Jacob. It was about the shape of redemption itself, the pattern of divine grace that reaches down before we reach up, that meets us in our deception and transforms us into something new. The fugitive sleeping on a stone was a preview of every sinner who has ever fled the consequences of their choices and found, to their astonishment, that God was waiting for them in the wilderness. The ladder was a promise that the gap between holy God and broken humanity would not remain unbridged forever. The voice speaking in the darkness was the same voice that would one day speak from a cross. It is finished. For those who hear this story across the centuries, the message remains unchanged. The God who met Jacob at Bethel still meets wanderers in their wilderness. The God who wrestled Jacob at Peniel still engages with those who will not let go until they are blessed. The God who kept every promise to a deceiver still keeps his promises to all who trust him, not because they deserve it, but because he is faithful. The ladder still stands between heaven and earth. The angels still ascend and descend. The voice still speaks to those who have ears to hear. Jacob died in Egypt, far from the land of promise, but his bones were carried back to Canaan, and buried in the cave at Machpelah. His body rested in the Promised Land even though he had spent most of his life in exile. It was a final testimony to faith, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The man who had dreamed of a ladder stretching to heaven was laid to rest in the earth, but the promise continued through his descendants, and through them to a descendant named Jesus, and through him to all who would believe. The stone pillar at Bethel has long since crumbled. The exact location is disputed by archaeologists and scholars, but the reality it represented endures. Heaven has touched earth. God has spoken. The dream was true, and somewhere, perhaps even now, a fugitive is lying down in a wilderness of their own making, their head on a stone of circumstance, their heart heavy with guilt and fear. And if they sleep, they may dream. And if they dream, they may see a ladder reaching to heaven, and angels ascending and descending, and hear a voice speaking promises that seem too good to be true. Because the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is still the God who appears to deceivers and calls them by new names. Still the God who wrestles with those who will not let go. Still the God who keeps his word, age after age, to all who will trust him. The night that heaven touched earth at Bethel was not an isolated incident. It was a window into the eternal reality of a God who descends, who speaks, who promises, who transforms, who keeps his word. The ladder still stands, the gate of heaven remains open, and the God of Jacob is waiting to be found by all who, like Jacob, discover that they were never really running from him at all, but toward him all along.